Hello, I'm David Sibbett, President and founder of the Grove Consultants International. That's my picture down there in the lower right. And this is an audiographic presentation, about 15-20 minutes long, about the Agenda Planning Kit for Strategic Visioning, which is a new tool that our customers requested to help them design and organize strategic visioning processes in their organization. Before I get into the talk, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I've been working for about 35 years applying visualization to business processes, starting at the strategy level and the implementation, using for learning. And all during the 1990s and aughts, the Grove has been developing large graphic templates that allow people to do visual planning even if they don't know how to draw or be illustrators. And many of our customers worldwide have asked for tools that would help them actually design the agendas for these meetings. So that's what this tool is about, and that's what I'd like to explain in this presentation. I'm using here one of our digital graphic guides, which uses it's called the Meeting Startup Graphic Guide, that uses a river raft metaphor as its orientation. And it basically says if you want a really productive meeting online or in a presentation or even in a live meeting, you first want to know where you're headed, what your outcomes are. Then you want to get everybody in the same boat or the same agenda, structure, and then you'd like a little control on the river with roles and rules. Now this spells oars, and it's just a memory device for remembering these four things. In this particular presentation, I'm just modeling what we did on a web conference on the same topic. Here are the outcomes that I have for this little presentation. First of all, I'd really like you to get to know strategic visioning and as a planning system and understand what that is, and then learn how to use the Strategic Visioning Agenda Planning Kit to plan those processes, and then learn a little bit about the supportive Grove products and services. Now, just to give you an idea what a completely filled out graphic guide might look like if you were running a web conference, it might look something like this. And over on the left, I've got a little agenda for this talk. We're in the orientation phase right now, and then we're going to do an overview of the kit, its components and uses, and then additional Grove resources, and then a little bit of closing comments. In a live meeting, I would be talking about the roles and the rules. In addition, if you save this presentation, you might note here our telephone, and feel free to call us if you have additional questions. So who is this agenda planning kit for? This gives you a little portrait of some of our tool users all around a picture of our little home at the Presidio Thoreau Center for Sustainability. We're in a Queen Anne Victorian there in the midst of the Presidio, San Francisco. And probably our primary customers are graphic facilitators and architects and consultants who are all across North America, Europe, and even now increasingly in Asia. We also have quite a number of community colleges and nonprofits and social service departments who are using our work, as well as the high-tech industry on the West and the East Coast. Plenty of manufacturing firms and suppliers, government agencies, and of course overseas people. This is an extremely flexible cross-boundary way of working, which is one of the reasons over the 35 years of our existence we've seen a steady organic growth and continuing embrace of visual thinking for business. Now, let me orient you to what strategic visioning is if you don't happen to know. Here's a little picture created by our director, Tiffany Forner, that shows a large meeting. It was actually developed from a photograph of a real meeting, and around the edge you'll see these large graphic guides, which are 4 feet by 8 foot templates that walk through the major kinds of considerations you need to do when you're doing strategy work. If you notice up here on the right, this recorder is starting to do a little history map, and over here on the left there is a context map waiting for use. Now let me show you this in a straightforward view so you can see what it is. We call this a context map, and in its large meeting version it's 4 feet by 8 feet. And it just shows trends coming in from both sides: political factors, economic climate, technological factors, customer needs, and uncertainties. Now here's an example of it filled out. An architectural firm did strategic visioning, and this was an actual context map I created for them. And you'll notice the yellow stickies are where I have customized these categories up here. And down here, they wanted to talk about service differentiation. Over here, they wanted to talk about people and demographics. And the other categories they used the same. And once we'd gotten an agreement on this, we then went through and just listed and had a great conversation about what was going on in their larger business context. Once we finished that, we posted it on the wall and went on to the next thing that we did, which in that case happened to be a SWOT analysis. So the strategic visioning process, shown here as in our model, kind of walks through and creates kind of a Lego block approach to doing strategy work that you can do one pass through this model in a 1 or 2 day offsite, or you can stretch it out over a series of virtual meetings, or you can stretch it out into a big in-depth 6-month process. So just to give you an idea about it, during the preparing stage, one of the graphic guides you might use would be a meeting startup graphic guide like the one we just saw. During the exploring and learning phase, over to the left, and the blue stands for kind of hindsight or looking at the past, you might want to tell your history, flesh that out graphically, or you might want to do a context map. Of course, anything that you know about the environment would be slightly historic at the time you're talking about it. And then eventually in step 3, you would want to agree on current realities, and that's where you go to the traditional SPOT analysis, or some people would call this a SWOT analysis, of looking at strengths, problems, opportunities, and threats. Now this part of the cycle prepares you to then swing over to the yellow side, or the visionary side. With hindsight, you then want to match it with foresight, and foresight is really imagining plausible futures, not that predictably will happen, but which could happen, and which you might step up to creating. So a cover story vision is a tried and true strategy process of just standing in the future and making up a story as though you were covered on a major magazine. You then would want to take those kinds of ideas and ground them out in a 5 bold steps template that matches your vision agreements against big initiatives. And then each one of these initiatives you would probably want to then flesh out in a graphic game plan. So this is a very simple, the simplest level of going through a strategic visioning process. Now the strategic visioning agenda planning kit is one that would give you 3 variations on how to do this. And it starts with a process outline, which is a booklet of something like 20 pages that in text and pictures walks you through what I just briefly described visually. It then contains 12 agenda cards and 3 different options, a 1-day, a 2-day, off-site, and a virtual meeting set of options. And these are the typical ways you would start the process. And then it also includes 28 best practice cards that are then linked to these agenda cards. So you have the ability to actually literally lay out on a tabletop a visual view of what your meeting plan would be. Now let's look at how you would use the kit. The first way is for personal planning, just to read through these cards, to be reminded of the different choices you have, to do what-ifs with yourself. The second way would be to do client planning, where you would talk through options with a sponsor. If you're a consultant who's working inside of an organization or system, many times people haven't ever worked visually, and you need to actually show them how this works, and this agenda planning card kit does that. And the third way is here shown in this picture, is where if you have a design team and you're collaboratively working out a process. In this case, Tomi is up on the wall with a very big meeting startup guide, and she's actually put these little cards up in the agenda format using little loops of tape. So let's take a look at option A of using these for personal planning. And how would you go about actually working with this kit? Well, the first thing is to just play with the cards and see what they are. So you'd notice that the title of the card is up here on the top. This is a 1-day meeting card with 1 color, a different color for the 2-day meeting cards, and then yet another color for the virtual meeting cards. And each one of these cards, if we zoom in on it, is a series of time block activities. The white spaces here, you'll notice this white space is much longer than this first one, have really been designed so that you can visually scan and see how much time you're taking for each one of these steps. then each one of the steps has a little square and a number which relates to one of the best practice cards. So in this case, meeting number 1 of this virtual meeting process, and we picked out meeting number 4 as an example, would start with the ORS template, the meeting startup template. You then would go to reviewing plans and perhaps use a graphic game plan. And then you might, as a final next steps, do something on a flip chart that doesn't have a formal graphic guide with it. So here, this particular agenda planning card has 3 of these best practice cards that connect to it. So if you're working individually, you would just lay it out like this and start playing around and seeing what they say. If you look at the individual cards, one of the things that the Agenda Planning Kit is trying to do is to suggest that there's just not one way to do things. So if we go back to that card we were looking at before, you might want to use the River Rafting Graphic Guide, Meeting Startup Graphic Guide, but you might want to have a more traditional meeting room look. So we have a choice that is just a straight meeting room. Or you might want to have a little more whimsical approach and have a little treasure hunt. So there are 3 different ways to start a meeting that are included in the best practice cards. Now, not all of the choices have multiple choices, but quite a few of them do. Now, each of the best practice cards themselves is something that you would then study. And the front of it, if it's a graphic best practice, would have a picture of the graphic guide, and it would have a name of the graphic guide and a little bit of a description. But on the back, it then has a whole description here of the benefits of working with this particular step, the actual steps that you would use to go through it, and some tips for implementing. Now, this system was designed assuming that many of you would have some experience in group process and would be needing a reminder of what to do and not necessarily a whole complete description. As you'll see in additional resources when I explain that, we do have increasing layers of depth. If you're a new practitioner and want to know more about this particular way of working, you can get additional guides that would give you much more detail. But for the agenda planning kit process, for thinking through these things themselves, it's really good to have these in nice bite-sized economical chunks. Step 4 would then to draw up your own meeting plan, and I've pulled out a second digital graphic guide, the meeting startup guide that looks like a meeting room. And in this case, the metaphor is, what do you want to take out the door with you as an outcome? And over here in native PowerPoint is a little potential agenda frame. And as you're playing with these cards, you would then go in and actually start typing up the specific agenda that you want to use, which might not be exactly the same as the agenda planning card, although you can use that as a default. You also then can type in, what your roles and what your rules would be for the meeting. Now, option B is planning a meeting with a client or a meeting sponsor, and here Megan and Tommy from the Grove are modeling that kind of a meeting. And the first thing you would do with a sponsor is you want to agree on the desired goals and outcomes. If you're facilitating a process, the role of the facilitator is to serve the group's goals and serve the sponsor's goals. Now, if you happen to be a team leader or a manager, you yourself might be determining those goals. So clearly, this method can be used in either case. You would also want to decide on the timing. Is this a 1-day meeting, a 2-day meeting? Is it just one where you only have a couple hours here and there and need to work virtually? What really are the constraints there? And then the most important thing with a sponsor discussion, particularly an early on one, is to notice which of these elements seems most interesting. And you can literally tell it by sharing this and then just watching what the person's looking at. And they will reach for the ones that seem most interesting and read them and respond. And there's a lot of rich information right there about what's going to work and what's not going to work. People have very different levels of comfort with working in a highly visual way, and you really want to make sure you're working in a way that supports the sponsor and the other stakeholders. And finally, you could use this kind of a session to agree on your role, and there's quite a bit of variety in that regard. So option C is plan with a process design team. Now, this is similar to working with a sponsor. You would start by agreeing on outcomes, and you would explore options. But what's a little different here is you really have the ability to have the whole group go through a collaborative process of playing what ifs and doing different kinds of sequencing and sharing best practices and then customizing a design for that particular uh, organization and that particular setting. It's very easy to take 3x5 sticky notes and add in additional practices that aren't necessarily in this kit. Uh, we've because we're at the Grove have had such success with visual planning, a lot of the best practice cards are dealing with visual templates, but there are many, many other practices that aren't having to do with the graphic elements of meetings that you might well be bringing forward that are part of your repertoire. Now, once you've got a design, there are a couple of best practice cards in this kit that would give you some optional output from a design session. If your process has more elements than just meetings in it, and if it takes a whole team to conduct the process, let's just say your strategic visioning offsite is, a 2-day offsite that's, in one particular week, but you've got a bunch of tasks that you need to do ahead of time and some follow-up activity afterwards. You might want to take the graphic game plan and actually say, here are the objectives for this larger process, not just the meeting. And here are all the people who are going to be working on it over here on the left. And then in the arrow, here's our plan for actually leading up to the meeting and going through the meeting. So many times you can work with a meeting startup guide next to something like this and actually do the micro and the macro planning that you need to do. If you're doing a visual virtual meeting, you may well be doing this over a series of weeks or even months. And if timing over several weeks is important, and if there's several streams of activities, and you need to set intermediate milestones, then this format is probably better to use than the graphic game plan. And this one just is really a large calendar matrix. But again, it includes room to put challenges and other information here, to list the goals of the overall thing, and to show here the different milestones. And the different meetings can be illustrated when you're going to have them here. So these are 3 different ways that you can then manifest a design to the larger organization and share it. Now, you may then, after you've designed it, facilitate in a face-to-face setting, shown in this picture, but you also might be working virtually where you're not co-located. Or it's even possible, and we're starting to experiment with combining these things. And I'm not going to try to explain exactly how you do this in this audiographic presentation, but it is increasingly possible to actually have part of your meeting virtual and part face-to-face. Now, the Grove has additional resources for you to use. Here are some pictures of the alternatives. These wall guides here, the big ones, are used just like a flip chart, and you just write in them the way you would on a flip chart. The difference being the whole group can then think panoramically when you're done, rather than seeing a whole blizzard of small flip charts everywhere. But we also have tabletop graphic guides that are illustrated here that are smaller and literally fit flat on a table. So if you have a large meeting and you have a whole bunch of small breakout groups, you can have people brainstorm on a table and then feed up to a larger synthesis chart like this. That's a very good small group to big group process. And we also have personal guides showed down here at the bottom, which are 11 by 17 or A3 size, for pre-work and work in the meeting if you want individual reflection to go on. And then we have digital graphic guides shown, here's the casing shown here, that are in native PowerPoint format that can be used for virtual work. We also supply all the graphics supplies in terms of pens, tape, paper, sticky notes, and all the other things you need to work visually. Now, the digital graphic guides have just been reproduced in version 4. They're in native PowerPoint, and we finally have all the graphic guides included in them that are in our system at the moment. They're both PC and Mac compatible. They're used both for facilitation and documentation, in that some people might do a meeting startup guide like this ahead of time and send it out an email as a way to prepare for a meeting. It can also be used afterwards, any of these guides, as for documentation. They also include several agenda templates and some report templates if you want to drop, if you're working in a face-to-face meeting and want to drop digital pictures of charts into a report template. We've got some examples there. If you happen to have a 3.0 version of our digital graphic guides, you can get these new ones at an update price if you give us a call. Now, we found with this methodology that additional support services, human support services, are often very helpful if you're trying to get past some of the early stages of figuring out how to work this way. So we offer one-on-one coaching on process design. If just working with the agenda planning kit by itself is, you've got some questions or whatever, it's possible to call us up and retain us for an hour or a couple hours if you wanted, just for a design session all your own, either on the web or on just a telephone. One of the advantages of the agenda planning kit is you can have it in front of you on a telephone call and actually have a much more robust design conversation than if you aren't supported by something like that. We also are very willing to come in and help facilitate a design session for a more complex meeting if you need that kind of help. And we run training workshops in this methodology, and we also do have the ability to run these processes ourselves if you want to. But one of our primary focuses at the Grove is capacity building in our clients. So we'll often model a strategic visioning session early on when a client system has never seen anything like this and people want a really good example of it. And then that kind of almost becomes a co-training situation, and people take over pretty quickly and start doing it themselves. So this represents a whole pyramid of services that you can take advantage of. We also have additional services on www.grove.com, and in here you can see links to our team performance and graphic facilitation tools, which are also presented in highly visual ways. And you also, we have in our new website an ideas and resources section that has articles and blog items on how these things are used and how people in the field are using these tools. The agenda planning kits themselves come in a nice little see-through packet like this. So the little booklet and the cards, and there's a little thing that's almost like a software summary page that's in there. Come in a nice handy kit, and if you want to bulk order these kits for a whole team, we can make arrangements for that. And for large orders, of course, we'll arrange for special discounts. But one of our hypotheses here with these kinds of tools is that if everybody, it's much like software or any other kind of groupware, that if everybody has a common vocabulary and a common set of tools that they're pointing at, you can then come up with many combinations across different kinds of boundaries. It's really doing for visual planning what the invention of the piano did for music way back in the 14th and 15th centuries.